Clouds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. So, the 2016 Bugatti Chiron. Where to begin? Well, I guess the place to begin is a couple of months ago with the Bugatti Vision GT. It's a pretty sweet looking car. It's, as I mentioned back when we first saw the car, an apparent fusion of GT style race car and LMP machine. That's cool. Lots of people, myself included, have wanted Bugatti to make a hardcore version of the Veyron for years. It seems an obvious candidate. Just get rid of all that excess weight and you've immediately got yourself a monster track car. It doesn't even necessarily need any more power. That was what the VGT was essentially, a super sport in race trim. And then rumours started going around, as they do, that, oh, this is the new Chiron. No, it's not. It's a Vision GT car. But, as it happens, some elements of those statements were true. It's clearly not the same car. It has a completely different power plant. The front end is completely different in terms of design. The interior is completely different. And I don't mean different in as much as one's a racing version. They are two completely different cars. But to the 2016 model, what are my thoughts? This was actually a requested video. I thought about doing a reaction to a couple of the new cars from Geneva, I believe it was. A couple that I really like, including the new hardcore Zenvo track-only model. That looks pretty sweet. And of course, the show stealer, or what should have been the show stealer, the Chiron. The successor to the most technically advanced supercar ever made. Not a car which I ever particularly love that much. I know some of you guys do really like the Veyron, the Super Sport especially, for obvious reasons, but it just never really did it for me overall. I prefer cars that are more of a work of art with a steering wheel. Technical achievement is impressive, and I respect it, but I don't necessarily love the car for it. The Chiron has a lot to live up to, and it still hasn't been tested by Top Gear, Evo magazine, etc. So we're yet to see what it's actually like to drive. Doubtless it will be good with the amount of effort that Bugatti puts into their cars. But what are my first impressions? Well, obviously this is completely subjective. This is entirely my opinion. And there are some facts thrown in, some of the official released specs, but overall this is of course just my first impressions and opinion of the Chiron. Well, in terms of on-paper spec, it appears good initially, but then it kind of goes downhill. It's got 1500 horsepower for a start. That's cool. I also like the fact that it's still a relatively old-fashioned supercar. It's technically advanced, but it hasn't been tricked into going towards the electric hybrid route that many cars like the LaFerrari, the P1 and the 918 have. That's cool. It's kind of like clinging on to the old ways and making it slightly more of an analog supercar rather than a digital one. Slightly more mechanical. I like that. I respect that. To me that shows more craftsmanship. Technically advanced cars like the LaFerrari are certainly very impressive, but for every technological advancement you give them, they tend to lose a little bit of character. And it's an efficient track weapon, the P1 is as well, and the 918, but I don't know many people who have driven it who would say that the P1 is necessarily more characterful than the F1 was, or that the 918 is more fun than the Carrera GT, or that the LaFerrari is a better car than the F40 or the Enzo. There are some who would, but most wouldn't. Now, getting back to the Chiron, 1500 horsepower is pretty cool. That's more than the Koenigsegg 1.1. Not much more than the updated Hennessey Venom, actually, the SEMA Motor Show version, but still more nonetheless. It's a lot more than the Super Sport, of course, around 300 horsepower more. It has a lot of torque, almost 1200 pound-feet, which is pretty much the bog standard of what you need these days to get into the mega car club. But from then on, I must admit, for me personally, it kind of goes downhill, both mechanically on paper and visually. Visually especially, because this car was so overhyped, and understandably so. It's the replacement to the Veyron. The Veyron is still a big deal. 10 years later, and it's still a big deal. The Chiron had a lot to live up to. Visually, for me personally, it just doesn't do it. It lacks the hardcore edge of the Vision GT, but at the same time, it's not quite as elegant and classy as the Veyron. To me, the Veyron is quite a stately looking car. It has class. I don't necessarily think it's a pretty car, but I do think it looks luxurious and classy. The kind of car that you would expect a rich person to roll up in at an event. Or at least you wouldn't be surprised if they did. The Chiron, on the other hand, well, it has some interesting design cues. I like the Bugatti grille shape in the side of the car, which harkens back to the older models, such as the Atlantic. The back end is interesting. It has very much more of a hardcore, almost race car look to it, with the single rear light, again, reminiscent of a VGT car, and much more of a wide open back end, which Bugatti has said is designed to give the car a more lightweight appearance. Well, you can completely understand why they've done that, because they need to make it look light, because the unfortunate fact is, light it is not. In fact, and I'm sorry to disappoint those of you who don't know this already, it's heavier than the Veyron. It weighs 2 tons, 4,400 pounds. The Veyron was already just under a 1.9 ton car, so they've added another over 100 kilos of weight. That's kind of disappointing. Now, undoubtedly, it will still be quick with 1500 horsepower. But that brings us to our next problem. The acceleration is obviously going to be immense. I personally don't think it will beat the Hennessey, because as powerful as it is, 2 tons is a ridiculous amount of weight to shift. And the Hennessey is still a 1200 kilo car. The main issue that I have with the Chiron in terms of its performance is the top speed. Now, you'd expect it to be going, obviously, for over 270 to beat the Hennessey. They're not even trying that. They've been quoted as saying that that's the kind of speeds that it can do, but then they've speed limited it to 261. Am I missing something? What's the point in making a 1500 horsepower car if you're going to speed limit it? See, that indicates to me that they're actually not confident in their engineering, because Hennessey doesn't put speed limiters on their cars to save the tyres, but you don't hear of people killing themselves in Hennesseys. Maybe 1 or 2 have, but no more than any other supercar. That disappoints me. What's the point of making such a technically advanced machine, which it clearly is? I'm not downgrading the car by any means, but it just seems a waste of time to do all that and then speed limit it. And they did that before with the Super Sport as well, the non-bare carbon versions, the more road spec Super Sports had speed limiters. I don't see the point of that. That just seems weird to me. Now, they must have their reasons, and I haven't built a world-class supercar, so who am I to talk against them? But that's just my thinking. As far as the look of the car, I don't necessarily think it's an ugly car, because ugly is a very strong word, but I do think there are elements that don't suit it. The back end, to me, although interesting, is just not a Bugatti. From the back end, you could easily mistake it for a McLaren. And the headlights, to me, are probably the worst aspect of the design. They work on the VGT, because it's more of a race car. On the road car, it's got way too many lights. and they look cheesy to me. They look like aftermarket projector lights, like the type that you'd fit on your car in Need for Speed Underground. That has no place on a Veyron. Now, obviously, that's just my opinion. Feel free to disagree with it. Most will. But to me, it just lacks class. It's a flashy looking car. Obviously, it will sell well. They've already sold 150 of them on order. But it's just not a worthy successor, I don't think, to the Veyron. Time will tell, and I'm sure it will be quicker. But those are my thoughts, I guess. Overall, I'm disappointed. I was expecting more, because it is Bugatti after all. And with the Veyron, they didn't just step up the supercar game, they redefined the benchmark. Because before that, it was the McLaren F1. Now, they haven't upped the benchmark. It's become just another supercar. That's disappointing to me. But I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. I'm sure there's a huge following for this car already, loads of people who'd love to have one. To me, the star of Geneva was the Zenvo, the track model that I mentioned earlier. That surprised me far more. And I think one of the reasons why that car is my preferred, at least of the two, is that it wasn't hyped at all. It was a shock. And it didn't have anything to live up to. And to have a hardcore version of the Zenvo is an awesome concept. The Veyron, on the other hand, has such a massive amount of weight and importance on its shoulders, or not the Veyron, the Chiron, I should say, replacing the Veyron. And I don't know, I'm just worried about it. I don't think it's really a worthy successor, but hopefully time will prove me wrong. And for me personally, I still much prefer the VGT car to the Chiron. But that's it overall for my initial reaction and thoughts for the new Bugatti Chiron. And as I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.